What is up, guys? Alex from ANAK Creates here. Welcome back to another video. Today, we're going to be talking about drum programming and how to make your drum programming sound a little more natural. Some tips and tricks and things to think about when programming your drums to just give them that extra little bit of realism. Just because you're programming drums does not mean they have to sound fake. Now, recently, I had my friend Malcolm Cottle over on the ANAK Creates podcast to talk about this exact thing. And Malcolm is a very proficient drummer, so he approaches drum programming from an actual drummer's perspective. So I've taken some of the key points and some of the key things to think about and condense them down into this video. So I hope this gives you some insights, some tips and tricks, and just things to think about when it comes to programming drums. Enjoy. Where would you start when getting into programming drums? What's kind of the first thing to actually program drums correctly, I guess? Where do you start?
To start, it's like any instrument though, right? I mean, like any instrument can be replicated in a digital format, and it's all about kind of taking all of that extra time to do it right, to make it sound more real. It's as much about knowing how to program them to make them sound real like a drummer, as much as it is knowing how to blend them into a mix too, and where they're going to end up. Because I think that's one thing that we always forget about when we kind of like look at anything in production on this kind of like micro scale. It's like you got to back up and look at the macro view of like, okay, but how does this fit into the mix? There's a balancing act, I should say. When programming drums, it's about taking the time to really do it right, but then also remembering like, what is the point? The point is so that it can fit into a mix. So never forget that.
The things that are available now and the quality you can get and that you can actually coax out of the libraries, basically, if you spend the time to learn what they offer and how to use that. Get the right tool for the job, get the right library that for the thing you're wanting to go for. Don't get a metal kit if you're programming indie pop. It's going to sound like crap. It's going to sound like overly programmed drums.
Because they're not going to fit in the mix, because they're not meant to. Like, they're going to stick out. Like, there's going to be way too much attack on those metal drums.
Yeah.
And indie pop needs a lot more kind of thump and roundness to it. Yeah, That's a great point. Really get to know whatever is easiest to program for you. Programming anything, whether it's drums or anything, is find the one that just works for your brain. Like, the one that just naturally you kind of know where the articulations are, and it's simple, so that you're spending more time writing and less time like engineering in a sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But one of the easiest ways to get really authentic program drums is to play them in on a MIDI kit. Tons of brands make them. Yamaha makes them. Pearl has a really big one now.
Yeah.
My personal favorite has always been Roland. I think they've always kind of just been on the front end of electric eKits.
Right.
So I just have like a fairly basic one that just has a single MIDI out, and I just put that right in a computer. I pull up a kit, and I just like to play in the part, basically, like a real drummer. It's not perfect, but it will get you pretty close in terms of like the cymbal articulations and the way you kind of move around the kit.
Yeah.
I really like playing it in too, because I just tend to play the most natural thing too. And you'll never have that instance where like you like program a fill. Sometimes you're just like, oh, like my body can't like jump from one end of the kit to the other that fast.
Right.
Like I just can't physically do that. So it kind of avoids things like that you can't really do anything you can't play in. You know, avoid 127 velocity on everything.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest dead giveaway, is that like everything is completely jacked up. Like, don't worry about that. That stuff gets solved usually in mixing.
Yep.
Focus on velocities that make the most sense for what you're playing, and that give you that kind of wide dynamics, that wide range of dynamics, because you don't need the snare and the kick on 127 the whole time.
Right.
The engineer or the mix engineer, he'll take care of that later. Focus on good dynamics as a drummer can actually play. And generally speaking, it won't sound that good too. Most drum kits, their 127 is like a drummer who like ran back 2 meters and then ran at the snare, jumped and hit it so that they could have a 127 velocity sample. And so like it's almost choking the drum a little bit, because they're trying to get the biggest, baddest hit out of it.
Which is great in some instances, but to have that as your snare roll is not a good idea, because no drummer is going to play that.
Like 120 velocity is usually my cap,
right,
to give myself sort of a top end range, and then everything has to be below that. And then if I need to go back and like bump a couple hits up, then I have the space to do it. It's kind of like giving yourself headroom with mixing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like give yourself some velocity headroom, literally, so that if you need like a snare crack to be like the loudest thing in the mix, you actually have that headroom to give it to it.
For people who are new to drum programs, because I know there are people who kind of just use them and don't really realize how they work, but
in essence, the reason why this velocity thing plays a big role is what happens when people make a drum library or a drum instrument is they actually record multiple hits at a bunch of different velocity layers. So, when you play a drum, it's going to sound different if you just barely touch it versus if you beat the living shit out of it, basically. So it's going to sound very different. Just physics is going to make it sound different. Now, if you take a really big hit and you pull the volume down, it's still going to sound like that really big hit. It's impossible as a drummer when you're making a sample library to play 127 very precise different velocities. So what they do is they kind of do it in velocity brackets. So they kind of break it up. So there's maybe 5 to 7 velocity levels. And how they break it up, that's the instrument itself. But they do these buckets and then they do multiple in each bucket so that you don't also have multiple hits following up each other that are literally the same sample. Going back to the don't make everything 127, because that's the biggest hit a drummer can possibly do on the drum, basically. So you have to keep it lower than that so it's more like a natural drum like you'd hit it as a drummer.
Another thing that I realized one time in terms of like velocities is also that like the difference between a 100 hit and a 102 hit isn't going to be dramatic. It's not and it's good to know this kind of stuff because you got to know too that like you're not going to hear a significant difference in almost any drum sampler that you're using between 1 and 102. Right. It's triggering the same set of samples. So don't get too hung up on that. But if you even think of just music, like music notation, there's only 4 dynamic ranges really that are used even in music notation. There's piano, mezzo forte, forte, and fortissimo. And so it's the same kind of thing. Like, yeah, there's a lot in between that, but even like professional music only uses 4 dynamic kind of ranges that they use to indicate like how hard or how loud you're supposed to be playing right now. So keep that in mind. I guess everything's relative is really where this comes down to, which is always feels like a cop-out answer. But yeah, it is. Everything's relative. It's relative to how well the kit was sampled, how well the kit was, those samples were then programmed into the kit, like on the actual like digital programming, and then how much attention you take to the actual programming of the drum notation too. Kind of zooming back in a little bit, where you want to spend the most time is snare and hi-hat. To make a drum kit sound real, if you spend a lot of time making sure your snare drum sounds real and your hi-hats sound real, everything else will fall into place. But to me, those are the two that always sound out. And I think the reason is because the hi-hat and the snare have so much articulation that you can do with them. The snare, because the snare is such a dynamic drum, you can do so much with it. And it's central to every mix in metal and rock. Like completely different for the kick too. Like the kick in rock and metal, most engineers want to just control it so that it's not wobbling and it's really holding down the low end and kind of melding with the bass really well. So again, that's not a drum where you need to spend way too much time. The hi-hat too, because there's so much room for expression with the hi-hat too, because, you know, anytime you open up a drum sampler, you'll have a fully open hi-hat, you'll have a mostly open hi-hat, a slightly closed, a stomped down hi-hat. You got the bead and the shaft of the stick hitting on all of those too. So like right there, you have 8 different articulations that you can use. And if you actually really watch a drummer, like spend time just watching how a drummer plays the hi-hat. When you play the hi-hat, especially for fast sections, it's kind of more about a sawing motion than it is like an up and down motion. Drummers kind of use a sawing motion where they kind of stab the hi-hat with the bead. And then they kind of, as the stick is coming back, hit it on the edge with the shaft. So you get this, and you almost kind of get this, a bit of a gallop sound, but it's in straight 16ths or 8ths or whatever you're doing. But just the sound of it almost gives it kind of like an up and down kind of momentum. And little things like that really make your programming come alive and sound real. Another one with snare too is that like if I have 2 snare hits that are, you know, one after another really quickly, the second one is always less because most drummers are right-handed. And so the right hand will always hit just a little bit harder than the left. And most drummers lead with their right hand too. So there's a little bit of a phrasing usually where the first hit is hard on the right hand. And then the left hand will be a little quieter. And then if they keep going, both hands will kind of get a little quieter. And then as they get louder, the right hand will tend to be still a little bit louder than the left hand and kind of lead the crescendo. So you'll hear like a ba da 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 da, and that left hand will just kind of hang back just ever so slightly. And if you can program that right, if you can spend the time to figure out how that's programmed, oh man, your drums are not going to be distinguishable between real drums, especially if everyone else is sampling. Like, and that's the thing to me too, is like, if you can get really good at programming drums, oh, you can save yourself so much time.
That's going to come out as well if you play the actual drums in using an eKit. Regardless of how, the quality of the eKit, it will pick up some of that stuff just by the nature of you playing it.
One thing I would advise if you are a drummer trying to program, or even if you're not a drummer, but you're at least familiar with the mechanics of drumming, is program something in and then just sort of air drum it. Like, listen back to it and air drum it, and really just like watch your wrist, watch how you air drum back to it. Like, watch the way you move around the kit and just see like, okay, where is there a little bit less strength as I go around, and should and can I and do I want to program that in too?
Another thing that I think a lot of people don't think about with programming drums is timing. Now, when you think of programmed drums, you think of just gridded. It's perfect, hit Q, and it's perfectly in line, and this is great. And
I love that button.
That's exactly what everybody wants with real drums anyway. Which, I mean, yes, but here's the caveat to that, is that even real drums, even when they're gridded, they're not perfect. But, you know, think about a drummer. If they hit a kick and a snare and a crash all at once, that's like the big, you know, downbeat, whatever, they're not going to be literally the exact same timing. We're human. It's going to be milliseconds late or early or whatever, maybe not even milliseconds, but slightly different timing. That is still baked into the timing of the drums. So when I time that hit, I'm going to pick the kick drum and put that on the grid. I can't make the snare that is
ever so slightly
a millisecond ahead. I can't put that also on the grid, and the crash also on the grid. I can't do that. It doesn't work with the physics of recording multi-track drums. It just doesn't work. So the natural sound that you get has this slight flamming, so to speak. It's flamming in terms of the cymbal, the snare, and the kick are all slightly off time. And I think that's very important to note, is when you program drums, you can also kind of tell when people just literally hit Q and all of those slight flams are no longer slight flams. They are all exactly perfect. But if literally every hit in the drums is exact on time with each other, you're going to start to notice that.
It's just the reality. I mean, one of the ways we drummers are taught in terms of how to make something sound bigger when we don't have something bigger is to use a flam. So like when I want like a big like war drum sound and all I have is a 16-inch floor tom, what I do is I just put a really tight flam when I go to throw the hit, and it makes it sound bigger. It makes it sound like two drums are hitting at the same time as opposed to just one. So I do that on the toms all the time with my programming, and it makes the tom double hits sound a lot bigger, because they're not played 100% in sync. We're not talking like musically a lot of space between these things.
This isn't to say that every single snare hit should now be a double stop. Don't do that. No. But you know, you can't go that far. But think about the real kit when something like the kick and snare are happening at the same time on a 4-on-the-floor beat or whatever it is. Don't literally put the two MIDI notes exactly on the grid. You can move the snare slightly behind or slightly ahead. And again, like we said, minuscule. So you don't even notice that it's different, but it is not the exact same, and that'll start making things sound bigger and more natural, because that's literally that's how it works. It's more in terms of when a bunch of stuff's hitting together, that's when you start moving them slightly off from each other.
It's like panning. Like if everything is straight up the middle, it's going to sound a little jumbled, but that's why we use panning, is because we move things kind of left to right, create a more stereo image, but it also gives a little bit of space to everything to have, because now it has its own little space, not only in the EQ image or the EQ frequency, but also in the stereo image as well. It's the same like basic principle, but just a lot smaller and a lot more subtle.
Yeah.
That is it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Now, the key thing to remember when it comes to all of this is use your ears. How does it sound? If it sounds good, then it is good. It's all a matter of context in your tracks and in what you're doing. Just try to take some of these things into consideration, the ones that apply to you and the music that you are making. But I will see you in the next video. Until then, always be creating.